speakers event with Governor Dave Freudenthal. My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm the Wyoming State Archivist. We are pleased to have Governor Freudenthal talk with us tonight about his book, Wyoming, the Paradox of Plenty, the Lure and Risk of a Mineral Economy. This is part of our special program ring in honor of Archives Month. Wyoming and American Archives Month occurs every October in celebration of the work of archivists and archives across the nation to collect, preserve, and provide access to our shared documented history. Our Archives Month programming will conclude tomorrow at lunchtime. We will have a special talk about the roving archivist program. So if you need help getting with your archives and how to care for your materials, please check in and learn more about that programming. And we will be resuming our normal speaker series event a week from Thursday with the POWs of Camp Douglas. So please feel free to join us for that event. So now on to tonight's event. I want to introduce Governor Dave Freudenthal.
Thank you. Okay. I was supposed to make sure that one was off since I have on a mic. It's okay back there? All right. So first of all, I appreciate you all being here, and I would note for the record that my lovely bride, Nancy, has joined me this evening, and she joins me more often now that her hearing is going, because then she doesn't have to listen. But she claps when she's supposed to, and on the way home, she'll always say, "You did a lovely job." So this book came about in response to a question from a friend of mine who wanted to know how we got stuck on this addiction to mineral revenues. And I, of course, said passage of the Severance Tax of 1969, which turned out to be a bit of a flip answer. So I didn't have a lot to do during COVID lockdown. I mean, all of my clients had gone to Zoom and meetings so that, I didn't have to travel, and so I could do the work and then meet by phone. So I spent evenings and weekends and stuff researching. And it turns out that a number of the conceptions I had were wrong. First of all, the sort of things related to our mineral addiction really begins all the way back at statehood. So we're going to begin where everything begins, which is, we became a territory in 1869. At that time, there were 4 or 5 counties, and they stretched from the northern border to the southern border, with the population being clustered along the UP Strip, as you'd expect. Then didn't take us very long to get really angry about how we were treated. President Grant sent out some really obnoxious governors, equally obnoxious. No, I'm not saying he didn't appoint me, but I may be obnoxious, but I wasn't appointed by Grant. Federal judges. And it was a pretty tumultuous time in Wyoming. It was largely unsettled and largely controlled by the Union Pacific Railroad. So the citizens couldn't decide whether they disliked the railroad more or they disliked the sort of federal absentee folks who were sent out here to run things. It was early on that let me back up. At the time we became a territory, there was a general national policy that they didn't want to admit a lot of new states. By the 1880s, that policy had begun to shift, particularly under President Harrison. They wanted to admit as many new states as they possibly could. And so Wyoming caught that wave. We may have misrepresented substantially how many people lived in the state. We probably properly represented the number of livestock by saying it was about 3 million. It was interesting to read the proceedings of the constitutional debate. The enthusiasm that people had about Wyoming and its prospects was so remarkable in terms of a contrast with the kind of political rhetoric you hear now you know, the world's coming to an end, we're all going to rot in hell, and just kind of go through that. But these people were fundamentally optimistic about their prospects of Wyoming and its future. At some points in the conversation, they would talk about soon there'll be 1 million people in Wyoming, which is a bit of braggadocio for a state that could barely say there were 60,000 of us, although they claimed 80. They claimed 80-some thousand people in the state, and the census that came out the year after we became a state demonstrated fewer than 60,000. But, you know, people in Washington wanted to admit new territories, and we were it. Plus, they had to figure out, what do you do with the lands that were left after they'd carved off the areas that wanted to be the Dakotas, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. We were sort of in this position of, what do they do with this thing? There was a point at which Ulysses S. Grant became so frustrated that he suggested that they just dissolve Wyoming, the Wyoming territory, and allocate it out to the other surrounding territories and states. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But the rhetoric of the Constitutional Convention, I mean, it's a little arcane just because of the way language was recorded and spoken at the time. But the degree of energy and expectation about what the state would be was pretty great. But also their anger about the way they were being treated gave rise to some language that was included. Once the Constitution was adopted, they sent it out to the citizens. They noted all of their grievances. And among those it's kind of a long, you think the Declaration of Independence, United States Declaration of Independence, had a lot of grievances against King George. We had the same grievances against Washington, D.C. Included the abuse of the veto by alien governors, the lack of familiarity of alien judges with our laws, frequent changes in our executive and judicial officers, as it has been in the past and may again be in the future, cannot but discourage our people. We are citizens of the United States in name only, and we are disenfranchised. Territorial representation in Congress is a delusion. Taxation without representation, a condition in many respects allied to colonial vassalage, with many wrongs that follow the application of those two anti-American terms, and with which you are familiar. They have all united to render the condition of the people of Wyoming the most energetic, most intelligent, and most patriotic citizens of the United States. Our conditions are well nigh intolerable. So that was the introduction to the citizens of a request that they vote to approve the Constitution. Constitutional debate reflects the same divisions that exist in Wyoming today between northern counties and citizens and southern citizens. It's changed a bit as Casper became larger and more metropolitan. At the time, Casper was, well, it was like most of northern Wyoming, largely unsettled, and so they were part of the discussions. But it was kind of this remarkable fight over everything from how to set up the legislature and what the allocation would be in terms of the counties and the population. But they got through it, and they got through it with a spirit of compromise that we don't find in today's politics. And without that compromise, the Constitution would never have gotten adopted, which is frankly also true of the American Constitution. The Constitution envisioned a governmental structure in which the counties were the driving force. A delegate named Mr. Potter talked about what it is that they were going to rely on for counties for. And he said, more particularly, what is a county in its relations to the state? Simply a medium by which the state conducts its business. The state cannot take up all the various details of government, of taxation, of the assessment and collection of taxes, of all matters that the citizens are interested in. This power must be delegated to someone, so the state delegates some of its powers to the counties, and the machinery of the state is kept in motion and organized by the counties, not as independent parts of the state, but as a subsidiary part of the state in every respect. If you believe the biblical admonition that your heart is where your treasure is, you can find that where their heart was with counties. When they came to allocating taxation authority, they gave 12 mills of taxation authority to the counties, 8 mills to the city, and only 4 mills to the state. The counties, interestingly enough, also had authority to charge $2 to each person between the ages of 20 and 60 to support education. And at that point, it's clear that what they envisioned was very much a county-centric government in the state. Now, obviously, that's been turned on its head by a number of factors, but it was interesting in the debate the extent to which they expected state government to be very small. They expected county government to be very large, and municipal government had a limitation on its taxing authority with 2 exceptions. One is they could impose additional mills to handle sewage, and they could impose whatever they needed to in order to secure water, both of which are logical, particularly in a state where the municipal areas were some distance from water supply. A lot of them built up in relative proximity to railroad to water supply because that's where the railroad wanted them, because they needed the water to keep the railroads running. 2 things they needed to locate a community was coal and water. And so if you look at the map, the way it sorts out, the distance between communities at that point was largely determined by the railroad's capacity to move based on the amount of coal the train ran and how much water it had in order to make the next stop. And so that provision that allowed cities to do whatever they needed to do to get the water was entirely logical. The Constitutional Convention also had a very clear view about what it wanted to do with taxes. It believed that all property, real and personal, should be valued at 100% of fair market value. And it gave rise to a really interesting system because it taxed, if you look at the early tax rolls that are combined, it has chickens, it has pigs, it has beehives, it has watches, private libraries, appliances, and you had to differentiate between whether it was a gas appliance or an electric appliance. All of this was valued for purposes of taxation. The notion being that, remember at that point, nobody envisioned sales tax or government revenue, federal government revenues. They were going to build this state on their own. And that's the other thing that you come out of reading that Constitutional Convention with, was these people were going to build this state and they were going to pay for it. And they were prepared to pay for it. And they understood that that meant taxation and that this sort of almost Puritan notion that you provide for yourself. I mean, we now call it the cowboy code or the cowboy ethic, which frankly is aspirational because we don't really follow it. We're the most heavily subsidized people in America, but by God, we stand on our own 2 feet and we pay our bills and all of that. The difference between mythology and reality. And the property tax system was going to be ad valorem. That meant at value. And it was going to base the value of the property on its fair market value. They called it something different then, but essentially it was the value of the property in an exchange between a willing buyer and a willing seller. That would set the fair market value, and that's what the taxes would be based on. The system obviously was comprehensive. I mean, they taxed everything. They kept track of everything. Banknotes, inventory, all the rest of it. But it was designed to make the state self-sufficient. There was a debate about how to value coal lands. Now, you got to understand the context in which it occurred. People now say, well, it was just a severance tax debate. It really wasn't. The problem they had was that at the time, you didn't know how to value coal lands from which coal could be produced, because they didn't have the kind of technology we have now where you could estimate the reserves and you could figure out what the property was worth. So they ended up with a proposal that there would be a unit tax on each ton of coal produced. Well, that gave rise to a set of people who complained, well, you can't single out coal because after all, It was, we were going to be mining gold and silver. There were great expectations that we would have gold and silver development the same way that they had in Colorado. And so there was this discrimination question with regard to coal only. There was also a fight because the people who proposed it said 2/3 of the revenue would go to the state and 1/3 to where the county came from. Well, with the convention being focused on county government as the proper receptacle of funding, part of the fight was we're not going to pay for it. We're not going to pass anything that puts more money into state coffers. We want it to go into the county. And it's an interesting debate, one that was somewhat echoed in the years when I worked for Herschler. They were fighting about severance taxes, slightly different twist, but the same notion of how do you capture value on a product that is mined once, sold once, and moved out of the state. And in their case, because of the question of should it apply to all minerals that are developed, they ended up putting in the Constitution the gross products tax, which meant for every mine or oil well or whatever it was, every extraction of a mineral, it would be taxed on the gross product. That is what is produced from that mine or oil well or proposition. But it would be left to future legislators as to how and at what rate it would be taxed over and above the normal tax. So what happens is, and still today, we have a gross products tax on minerals that is subject to the county mill levy, the school mill levy, and all of those, plus the severance tax. So what you have is a property tax on minerals, then you have a severance tax on minerals. And that's the way this system was designed at the time. The expectation of huge mineral development in Wyoming was writ large in each of the states. When they wanted to become states, they sent a memorial to Congress, a memorial requesting admission as a state. And in Wyoming, they had this list of things that you had to show to Congress in order to do it. Well, we lied about population. We didn't lie about livestock. And we were incredibly optimistic about minerals. The language is a bit stilted because of to our ears, because that's the way things were written at the time. They go through this great description and they say, in addition, there are great storehouses of mineral wealth containing not only gold and silver, copper and tin, but almost an unexampled supply of other minerals such as iron, asbestos, mica, plumbago, which I don't know what that is, sulfur, mineral paint, kaolin, fire clay, gypsum, also granite, sandstone, limestone, and marbles in great variety. Moreover, outside of the mountain ranges, some 20,000 square miles of broken basins are underlain with coal of excellent quality and veins of extraordinary thickness. Vast deposits of soda and magnesia in many localities, while the oil basins are so many and so extensive as to indicate that Wyoming may become one of the most important oil districts in the world. So much of it was recognized, the mineral potential of the state, and that was part of their pitch. They were admitted to the Union without too much discussion because the national policy favored the admission of states. And so we went in, and then pretty quick 4 more came in. So remember, the idea was all property valued at fair market value, subject to the applicable mill levies. And that was, it's basically a sound policy. Well, starting about 1900, it began this process of what proved to be illegal and unconstitutional tax relief. That is to say that they began to depart from fair market value by what they call the debasement ratio, and that we now call an assessment ratio. So slowly but surely, they moved away from fair market valuation. And they did it fairly quickly. They did it without a benefit of rulemaking. They did it without a benefit of statute, and they did it without benefit of Constitution. Constitution was very clear at the time, and was that clear until 1988 when we amended it, that all taxation would be equal and uniform, and that it would apply to all property. And that was the law of the land, and that's what they meant. Starting about 1900, they started reducing the 100% value by 10%. Pretty soon it was 90% that got assessed. Pretty soon it was 80. And it just began to decline. And why that's important is if you figure you cut the tax base in half, or you reduce it. Remember, taxes are a function of the value of the property times the mill levy equals the amount of money you raise. Well, if you insert a debasement or assessment ratio, it becomes the fair market value times an assessment ratio, which reduces that fair market value times the mill levy and produces less money. So a property that was valued at 100,000 and subject to tax would produce X. If you had a debasement or assessment ratio of 50%, that same property would produce only 50% of X in terms of revenue. So we're sort of cutting our own throat. So this is going on, and the only bright light on the horizon was the passage of the 1920 Mineral Leasing Act at the federal level, which grew out of two things. One was a concern developed during World War I that ships were shifting from coal to oil. And the question is whether we would have adequate oil reserves for national defense. And the other was that you had the monopolies formed around oil development and a lot of illegal stuff, Teapot Dome, a few other scandals. And so they began to withdraw those lands. So there was a big fight, and it pitted the western states, public land states, against the eastern interest as well as California. The reason that the western Rocky Mountain states fought so hard against it was that at the time, if you filed a claim to develop oil or gas or any other mineral on federal land, you got the land free and clear. That is, it became patented private property, and it was no longer federal. And from the point of view of the states, that meant that added land to their tax rolls, and the developers wanted to own the land instead of have to lease the rental from the feds. Well, it sorted out that it was clear there was going to be a leasing program. So the fight came up, what happens to the money that the federal government gets? And on this, the western states prevailed. 37.5% went to the state from which the mineral was extracted. 10% went to the federal treasury. The remainder of it went to build water projects, largely in the West. Through that time, it was more the Army Corps of Engineers or the Army Department than it was anything else. So in terms of the split of the revenue, the public lands states won. Severance tax was not discussed too much during the 20s, except for in 1924. There was a constitutional amendment proposing a severance tax. It was on the ballot. The number of people who voted in favor exceeded the number of people who voted against it. But under Wyoming law, the majority of the people who showed up to vote had to have voted yes. So the people who didn't vote on the severance tax proposition were counted as no votes. So the severance tax lost, which that's just the law in Wyoming. During that same time, the Depression hit Wyoming early and hard. It didn't wait for the stock market crash. Agricultural markets were bad. The demand after World War I for oil and some of the agricultural products declined quite a bit. And there's a point in which 1 in 5 people in Wyoming were on the rolls. People were hurting. And if anybody in this room has done title work, as I have done, it's amazing how many tax deeds you find in the title records of people who couldn't pay their taxes, and the land ended up being owned by the county. And it was a pretty common practice. The place I grew up on in Thermopolis, I think there were 4 different parcels in there that my grandfather and my father had picked up through tax deeds during that time. But that was, and you can see, it's interesting, in the Department of Revenue reports, they will list all of the land that was no longer on the tax roll because it had been taken over by the county and therefore not subject to tax. So the recession hits, and well into the early 30s, it was awful. Federal government was providing aid. FDR had been elected, and they had an election, 32, and the guy who won promised to reduce government expenditure by 25%, which he did, and then the legislature cut it deeper, because the theory then was that the route to prosperity was to cut the government back. Unfortunately, that increased the number of people who didn't have aid. Also defeated a lot of the farm to market roads, and it actually ended up making things worse instead of better. So they knew they had to raise revenue. They got in a big fight about an income tax, or do we legalize gambling and we'll tax it? Or, I mean, they did stop short of legalizing prostitution, so we're still ahead of Las Vegas. But I mean, they were looking for revenue. They got in a big fight, so they hired a consulting firm out of Chicago. This consulting firm came up with a set of recommendations. One, we'd only have a unicameral legislature, so you'd get rid of the House and only have the Senate. You would take some 400 odd school districts and consolidate it into one. You would reduce the number of counties. Everything that people in Wyoming hated, oh, they were going to create a state police force instead of county sheriffs. Other than that, it was really well received. I mean, they were just, I mean, people were mad. And they had some recommendations about taxation, which included quit applying these assessment ratios and actually tax the way you said you were going to. Well, obviously, the combination of being from Chicago and the recommendations, it was doomed. One thing that hasn't changed in Wyoming is we don't need anybody's ideas from outside. We're quite capable of screwing it up on our own. So they end up settling on a sales tax in 35. And the sales tax can be 2%. They excluded, as you'd expect, egg products and services and some of that. And they passed it as an emergency measure because, you know, if you're going to give bad medicine, you got to say, it's going to be short-lived, it's going to go away. Of course, it got set up was solidified in 1937. And the interesting thing is the local governments, who were the primary deliverers of services, petitioned the legislature for part of the money. Legislature said, no, you don't get any of the money. And further, they added a provision that said no local government could impose a sales tax, which is why, as things have unfolded, you know, the legislation had to be done for optional taxes, resort tax, and the rest of it. And so from the beginning, the legislature was quite stingy about revenue. So the other interesting fact related to that sales tax passage was the state mill levy prior to the passage of the sales tax ran between 4.5, 5 mills. Once the sales tax had passed, the mill levy for the state never exceeded 2 mills, except for one time when it was 2.5 in the next 34 years. So what they did is they effectively translated that into a tax break for every citizen in the state. So they were getting a tax break on the mill levy, as well as a tax break on how we valued the property. That's sort of, that went on for quite a while. The next time severance taxes came up as an issue was in the 1950 gubernatorial election. There had been a proposal in 49 during legislature to impose a severance tax. The two candidates divided, as you would expect. The Democrat favored a severance tax. The Republican opposed it. The what was called the Western Petroleum Association, I think Rocky Mountain Petroleum Association predecessor, came in and just beat the hell out of the Democrat. Or as Larson observed, they smited him with the mighty jaw, and he lost. So that was the end of the severance tax discussion. The state's economy changed substantially after 1950. Up until 1950, it was primarily coal, oil and gas, and ag. With 1950, when you see the return of the soldiers from the war and the baby boomers and all of that, you ended up with a couple of things happen. One is tourism took off, and people started to want to visit the parks and other kinds of things. So tourism, which had up until then been a pretty nascent industry, began to take off. The other thing is that over the next few years, thanks to the federal government's desire to secure adequate supplies of uranium for missiles, they subsidized the development of an entire uranium industry. And the Wyoming politicians fought to make sure that that included Wyoming, which it did. We ended up with 5 mills and a really substantial industry, all of which was underwritten by tax dollars, including road construction and a whole lot of other things related to it. Wyoming was never successful in getting a processing mill in Wyoming. What we ended up doing is that we had mills that would reduce it to yellow cake, and then the yellow cake was shipped off elsewhere. So it followed the pattern that already existed with regard to oil and gas. We produce it, we refine a little bit, and then it goes out. And in fact, in some cases on oil, we didn't refine it at all. The other thing that occurred was the bentonite industry took off because it had become important in oil and gas and in other applications. There was an iron mine that was opened up in Lander, which was really, really a good mine, very prosperous. There were some other ancillary industries, but by and large, the mineral sector had become much stronger between 1950 and the election in 1966, and tourism had taken off. One of the reasons tourism took off was when Governor Hansen came in, and he came in 62, I think. He wanted to see a lot more happen in tourism, so he created an independent travel commission led by a guy named Frank Norris out of Grable, and they really went after visitors, and they did what we do today, which is tie a lot of it onto the park in order to capture the dollars coming through. And in fact, tourism as a percentage of growth grew faster during that time than the oil and gas industry in Wyoming. So that was sort of how that happened. So we arrive at the 1966 election, which was Stan Hathaway from Torrington and Ernest Wilkerson from Casper. Ernest Wilkerson had the following platform: Wyoming wealth for Wyoming people. It was 1.5% to go, a severance tax on all minerals to go to operating, and 1.5% to go into a permanent wealth fund. Hathaway made fun of it, said maybe we ought to study it. He opposed it. There was a committee that would be comparable to current sort of dark money committees. An unidentified industrial committee ran ads against Wilkerson and talked about Hathaway as the right one. Hathaway won that election and won it rather substantially. So in 67, I mean, you got to remember at the time, both Hansen and Hathaway, they shared the founding fathers' ambition about what Wyoming could be, and shared the view that we would fulfill that destiny out of our own pockets. And so Hathaway and Hansen, both of their messages to the legislature during their tenures are incredibly progressive and incredibly thoughtful. Now, I know progressive is a bad word now, but when you look back at the Constitutional Convention, they summarized their constitution when they submitted it to the public as being both conservative and progressive, because it was positive about growth, it was positive about the prospects. And both Hathaway and Hansen were equally so. So Hathaway came in, and elected in 66, his message in 67 was really quite ambitious. And he called on the legislature to raise some of the sidebar taxes and to also increase the sales tax to 3%. They did all of that. And there was no voter revolt in 68. You didn't see people ran out of the House for having supported those taxes. And it was a bipartisan vote to raise them. So everything goes along fine. And you arrive at 1969, and Hathaway had equally positive views about what Wyoming can do, but he needed more money. Now, the myth out there is that the state was broke. That's not true. I looked at the documents. The state had a $30 million general fund. It had a $5 million cash reserve plus some excess revenues. State wasn't broke, but it wasn't able to fund what Hathaway wanted to do. So he submitted a budget that was underwater. And he didn't want to, in his message to the legislature, he couldn't say words like severance tax because he had opposed it. So in his budget message that accompanied his budget, he referred to a 1% tax on the extractive industry. Now, that may sound a lot like a severance tax, but we didn't call it that. Legislature passed it. And it was pretty, frankly, it was pretty unanimous, including people like Ed Herschler and Alan Simpson, who were in the legislature then. They voted for it on the concurrence vote. Once the severance tax was passed in '69, there never has been since then a statewide property tax. That is a property tax for the support of state government. So I graduated from high school in '69. In all my years, I have never paid a property tax to the state because there is no state property tax. And so when people say, well, we got to cut the property tax because we got to get state government, they might want to look at the books because that's not where the money comes from. So the other thing that was going on then was you could see looming on the horizon a vast mineral boom in Wyoming, particularly focused on coal. There was a report put out by the federal government that talked about 10 1,000 megawatt power plants in Gillette, a bunch of coal gasification plants to convert coal to synthetic gas, some plants to convert coal to oil. And remember, this was when it was a very unsettled time. And at that time, they were having conversations because this was before fracking and some of the really positive developments for the oil and gas industry. So they were concerned about whether there were adequate reserves. So you had a series of presidents who inaugurated, Nixon started Project Independence, Ford followed it up, and you read Ford's message to about energy, and it was bullseye on coal and uranium, both of which Wyoming had in a phenomenal amount. So we go through and the state's prospering, and you hit 1974. 1974, the legislature had obviously more Republicans than Democrats, but a substantial number of Democrats, and in both House and Senate. And the rumblings had continued clear back since '66 that there ought to be a permanent fund. Hathaway opposed it. The day the Republican caucus met early, and Republican leaders came down and said, well, Stan, there are enough votes between the Republicans who want it and the Democrats who want it to pass a permanent trust fund. And they were honest. They said, we don't know if there's enough votes to overcome a veto, but there are enough to pass it. So on this message legislature, Hathaway flipped his position and came out in favor of 1.5% for a permanent mineral trust fund. Now, if you think that that wasn't a surprise, the headline on the Casper Star the day after he gave his message was, Stan drops a bombshell. And the oil and gas people in Casper were just nuts. I mean, they were mad and they felt like they'd been stabbed in the back. And I mean, the rhetoric is really quite fascinating, but mild compared to the stuff now, but for its time, it was pretty strong. And it passed. So Hathaway left office having supported 1.5%, because it also included another 0.5% for operating, 1.5% severance tax on all minerals for the support of general operations, and 1.5% tax on minerals for a permanent wealth fund. Let's see. Oh, in '66, he opposed both of those. But I think it shows, I mean, it has the flavor of irony because history's full of it, but in some sense, it also reflects the fact that Hathaway read the Times and knew that we were headed into a mineral boom. And the size of the boom, you got to remember, between 1970 and the early 1980s, the gross state product in Wyoming, the total sums of goods and services provided, largely driven by minerals, increased by 500%. The population in that 10-year period grew more than it grew in the subsequent 4 decades. Right? And I expect people in this room are like I am, you can remember the boom and all of the discussion about that. So, I mean, I think what Hathaway saw was the notion that, look, this is coming, and we got to figure out how do we bring it to the advantage of our citizens. So the downside of it was that Hathaway engaged in a whole series of tax reductions. First of all, we said agriculture will not be valued on its fair market value. It'll be valued on productivity. That's why if you watch real estate ads, you know, when they're sending you an ad, buy this ranch or buy this property, they'll go through it and talk about multi-million-dollar price. And then they'll get down there and say the total taxation of it is like $2,000. That's because it's tied not to the value of the sale, but it's tied to the agricultural production on a kind of 5-year rolling average of how it adds up. They took the tax off of personal property held for personal use. They did away with the inventory tax. Counties used to have a welfare tax that was picked up by the state, paid for out of the general fund revenue money, and it significantly altered the tax base. However, my good friend Herschler, who was elected in '74, came in, you know, control growth on our terms, severance tax increases and that, but he also contributed to the erosion of the tax base with a number of little steps that he took. He didn't take as many as Hathaway because there weren't that many left. It wasn't that he had any particular virtue on the issue. It's just that there weren't that many taxes left to get rid of. But the one thing he did change was began to share state revenues with local governments, both federal mineral royalties as well as severance tax revenues, so that local governments whose tax base had been eroded, they were able to deal with it. Now, the other impact of erosion of the tax base was the creation of special districts. So why did they create special districts? Because special districts are not subject to the constitutional limitations on debt or mill levy. So in 1986, I think, we had about, 15 or 16 kinds of special districts and about 300 of them in the state. We now have 27 different kinds of special districts, and we have 8,420 of them, right? Everything from conservation districts to irrigation districts to cemetery districts, library districts, recreation districts. And if you add up the revenues raised by those districts, it exceeds the money raised by counties through their 12 mills. So we have shifted, again, away from the county structure to this sort of ad hoc. And I'm not saying they don't provide good services, but you know, they all have independent taxing authority. If you add up the mills that all of those together can impose, it's about 57 mills, right? And that's a lot. And I'm not throwing in the 43 mills that schools get. So where we ended up was not much of a tax base left. By the time they passed the severance tax in '69, the assessment percentage of fair market value was somewhere between 15% and 17%, meaning that you know, either 85 or 82% of fair market value was not subject to taxation by the time we did the severance tax in '69. So as I view it, if we'd eroded the traditional tax base and there had to be a substitute. First we turned to sales tax, and then we turned to severance tax. And the other thing that happened was in 1976, Cliff Hansen, Tina Roncalio, and Gail McGee were successful in raising the state share of federal mineral royalties from 37.5% to 50%, which made a huge difference during the energy boom. You got to remember, most of the minerals in the state that are developed come off of federal land, so that's an incredible source of revenue. So fast forward to this sort of next relevant point. In '86, late '86, mineral industry filed a lawsuit in the Supreme Court saying, this ain't fair. We're paying 100%. One of the reasons that all of the other non-mineral values could be reduced was that minerals stayed at 100% of our fair market value. So they were at 100%. Everybody else was, I don't know, 15, 17. Some industrial was at 25. I mean, there's a 1981 study by the Legislative Service Office. By the time you read it, I mean, it's just like this maze of different ways that the state was valuing property, and even different counties were valuing property differently, but none of it came close to fair market value except for on minerals. So they filed the case, and as you would expect, the Supreme Court then read the Constitution and said, what you've been doing since 1900 is unconstitutional. So since none of us wanted to have to deal with the idea of actually paying taxes, we just amended the Constitution. And so in '88, we amended the Constitution to say you're going to have 3 tiers of property. Minerals will be at 100%. Sort of industrial stuff will be at 9.5. Yeah. No, 12. She was on the tax board. She's got to be able to tell me. And anyway, residences and all other property at 9.5, except agriculture, which will be based on productivity. So we didn't want to have to deal with the idea that we'd been cheating and that maybe we hadn't been paying our taxes and that we were living off of federal money and that, we just didn't want to deal with that. So we just changed the Constitution. I mean, what the hell? We don't want to pay taxes, and we don't. We, on average, in this state, pay 14% towards the cost of the services we receive. Difference is made up with mineral revenues, federal revenues, and investment income off of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. And, the numbers are just stark. This is an amazing place for services, roads, and we complain about them, but I don't complain about them after I drive in Colorado, and certainly not after I drive in Montana. People complain about property taxes unless you're somebody in Laramie County who owns land in Nebraska, and then you think, man, this is Wyoming's a really pretty good deal. And I think that's true. We look at our kids who live in other parts of the country, what they pay for property tax is just amazing. You just look at it, that's our entire house payment. The average family in Wyoming, we're probably first or second in terms of the cost of health insurance. Average family in Wyoming pays far more for health insurance than they ever pay in property taxes. And health insurance is just eating us alive, but you can't get anybody to pay attention to it. We're too busy talking about a bunch of tax relief for people who already don't pay it. Now, let me be clear on that. I do think that there's a place for a program designed to make sure that people who are faced with increasing taxes, they're going to drive them out of their residence that they want to stay in until they die. I think that that's a sound social policy. It's a humane way to do things, but that should be treated as surgical, as opposed to talking about these proposals that we're going to cut the tax base by another 50%. We've already done it by more than 50%. Or that we're going to, with all due respect, I don't deserve a tax break. I take it. I complain whenever the tax bill gets there. How can the county demand this money? And what is this and what is that? But then you look at it and you think, well, in the span of 2 months, we've paid more for health insurance for the two of us than we're paying for property tax. And so it's a little hard to say that the biggest problem in my budget is the taxes on my house. But it's so much more fun to complain about. And you go to the county commissioners control less than 12 mills. It's really the schools, all the special districts, and all the rest of it that are kind of beyond the county's control. I think I close with this, which is one of the troubling things for me was when I did all this work, I discovered that all of this stuff we have about, we're the cowboy state, we pay as we go, we stand up, we're on our own and all of that, it's frighteningly untrue. And yet we continue to think that we're entitled to more and entitled to pay less. The other thing that is troubling is if you look at, we're looking at, $750 million of surplus. And we've had surpluses over the last few years. And I think we've used them improperly. I would have split it between savings and investing in communities so that we had businesses that wanted to move here. When I was in office, we did a lot of investment, did the Hathaway Scholarship, the Wildlife Trust. I'm proud of what we did, but we also doubled the size of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund because we invested at the same time we saved money. And here's why I'd argue that that's the best policy. Everybody says the government ought to operate on business-like principles. Businesses invest in the things that are going to make them better in the future. We're acting like a business that's going out of business. We don't understand that there is a future for Wyoming. It's not just me. It's not just today. And that the future, like any business, requires that that business continue to invest and grow or it'll die. And I think we need to rethink the allocation of the resources relative to the future. There's a great quote from David Brooks, a columnist, who says the only constituency for the future is the conscience of the present generation. And I think if we take that to heart, we need to start worrying about it. I mean, we complain about so many of our kids leaving the state, you know, to find a job and build a family. We have to travel to see our grandkids, not all of them, but we have to travel to see our grandkids. You think, you know, now I'm not sure they'd have stayed anyway. They don't want to be that close to us, but, you know, you'd like to see people have that opportunity. But when we were campaigning, it was in Evanston, and I go in, lovely couple, invited me in for a hot cider and a cookie, and you get to talking to them, and they say, we want economic development. And I'd say, well, if we have economic development here in Evanston, you may attract people in from, you know, Salt Lake or Rock Springs or, heaven forbid, from Green River. And they said, well, we don't want more people. We just want 3 jobs because we have 3 kids, and the jobs need to pay between $60,000 and $65,000 a year. And I think, how does that work? How do I have a bright future for my kids and not have a bright future for other people's kids? Now, if I could do it, yeah, I'm stingy enough to do that, but it doesn't work that way. So to me, it seems like we have to bridge the gap between what we say we are and how we actually operate. You know, you got to, you know, I don't know what, some 25 people voted against the entire budget. Well, I want to see them stand up and tell me which state park they aren't going to fund. Which state institution aren't they going to fund? Are they not going to fund the business council? You know, these sort of political holding your breath and shaking your hand at the moon, it's interesting, but it doesn't make Wyoming a better place tomorrow. And if there's anything I believe about the kind of leadership that has been exhibited over the years in Wyoming, people wanted Wyoming to be a better place tomorrow than it is today, but we didn't want to lose the intrinsic values. Right now, it seems to me we lack the confidence in ourselves that we can retain those values in a changing world. And the world's going to change whether you want it to or not. My law office, I get this blurb today from somebody wanting to explain to me how AI will make my law practice better. First of all, I don't know what AI is. I mean, I read all this stuff and it frightens me. I still like to read paper. I know that, you know, that's the definition of a troglodyte. But I mean, I can read the screen and all that, but it's just not the same. It's not the same as having a book. Now, my kids think I'm crazy, and I get that. And I want them to have a better life than I had, but I still want to keep my book. And so what I'm saying is we don't have to give up who we are to make sure that tomorrow can be better for both ourselves and for our kids. With that, I'll take questions. And if there are none, did you hear anything, honey? I'll be glad to answer any questions or hear your observations. Yes, sir.
What's the solution? How do you change the attitude of the legislature to do what you're saying?
We elect them. And when people say the legislature has to change its attitude, we have to be more discerning about who we elect. And stop saying that whatever I read on Facebook is how I'm going to do it. We have to be more educated. I mean, we get the government we deserve. And, you know, right now you got a lot of outside interest coming in who are funding things to kind of define it. We're smart enough to sort the wheat from the chaff. But when everybody says, what are we going to do about the legislature? I say, what are we going to do about us? I mean, they didn't get there by accident. Unless we change, you know, I mean, unless we're willing to invest our time to find people who want to make a difference as opposed to who want to make a splash, we're going to get what we get. I know, I mean, I mean, sometimes you're discouraged when you go in and vote because where you end up is, but the current climate, an awful lot of good people I know of both parties, I'm indiscriminate about who I ask to run. They just don't want to be in it. They don't want to be part of it. They're just sort of, you know, they don't want to be drugged through Facebook. I mean, I don't know about Facebook because I'm not on it. But I know people who are and who've been victimized by it. But I don't think, I mean, I think solutions in here. And that's the only thing that's going to change it.
So the Constitution says you can serve one more term. When are you going to run?
Let me see. Let me tell you, that bridge or that ship has sailed. You know, in fact, I hope to quit practicing law and we'll spend more time following our grandkids around the country. Sort of, you know, I mean, I wish people well, and I hope other people will get engaged. There are a lot of good people out there, but the price of running, it just, not so much in terms of money, but just in terms of abuse, I think is higher than it used to be. Okay.
Do you have a huge aha moment or a huge wow?
No, I had a series of, damn, I didn't know that. Or I hadn't thought about that. I mean, the part of it comes when you read the old Board of Equalization and Tax and Revenue Department reports. You begin to start, I mean, you can just see it unfolding. And I mean, I considered myself fairly learned about Wyoming history. I mean, having lived through a lot of it, but turns out, I mean, I'd seen I guess I'd seen the crest of the waves, but hadn't gotten down in the water. So there wasn't really an aha moment. It was just sort of, ew, I hadn't thought about that. And they also, I tell you, the people at the research division at A&I, I don't know what they're called now, and the folks at LSO, they were so great about, and the state library, great about guiding me to documents. I'd come in and say, I can't find this. Do you have any ideas where I'd look? And they'd help me. They didn't, I mean, they didn't try to influence what I was writing, really didn't care. They just, you know, you had this, and some of the questions are really obscure. I mean, right now I'm trying to figure out what was the sales tax revenues in the 40s, because I want to figure out whether if we had not destroyed the property tax base, would we have even needed the sales tax? And if I understand the numbers right, my instinct is no, because by the time we passed the sales tax, we had already reduced property tax values by 40%. So my guess is, but finding those numbers is tough. So I sent off some emails to people saying, I can't find this. But I wonder if we had not undone the property tax base, would we have needed these other taxes? And if you look at the current move, if you look at there's a presentation by Don Richards over at LSO, and they're all public, and one by Rob Godby over at the university, in which what they're showing is no matter what the state does, coal's going to kind of continue to plateau down. Natural gas prices, the long-term strip's pretty low. Oil's going to be kind of up and down. But Wyoming only has about 2% of the national oil reserves, and we're about 8th in production. So their argument is that more and more of the tax burden is going to be borne by the non-mineral taxpayer. And that's certainly what the data says. And so I'm not sure what that means for us. Long answer to a short question. Yes.
Wyoming Cowboy football game. There's this ad that comes on, it's been coming on for years by a certain group. I don't know if I should name the group, but it's basically saying Wyoming can take care of itself and we don't need no more new taxes. You may know the group that I'm talking about. And I'm thinking about, okay, that's going across the state. A lot of people listen to Dave and Kevin now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, You know, as it sits today, they're probably right. I mean, we got $750 million in excess. And what I don't like about that message is that it leads to this notion that Wyoming is going to end like, you know, we're going to retire. I mean, as we got older, less and less of our money went into investments and more of it went into secure investments to provide us with something to retire on. And that's what Wyoming's doing. But we're not going to retire. They're going to be people after us. And so what bothers me about those ads is, first of all, it's bumper sticker policy. It wouldn't hurt us a bit if we expanded the tax on renewables beyond wind to include solar. They get the same tax credits that the wind guys do. I wouldn't increase the mineral taxes. I do think that we have to get a little more serious about property taxes. I don't know that we have to so much increase them, because we got to figure out a better way to use them. But I don't see a compelling case today for increased taxes. I think there's a compelling case for us to develop some long-range plan that's going to allow us to build the state so that you actually diversify the tax base. I mean, people say diversify the tax base so that I pay less tax. That was part of the pitch surrounding the passage of the original sales tax. And so we forget that if you can diversify the economy, you're going to have more people. So they'll contribute to the tax base, but they're going to also contribute to demand for services. I mean, I think a lot of the choice is, do we want to grow, or do we just want to kind of stay the way we are? And we got to bear in mind that we're not going to stay the way we are, because we're the, I don't know, 10th or 11th fastest aging state in the country. And, you know, the enrollment at UW is down. More and more people are going out of state. You know, we're going to have more people if we're going to grow, which means we got to have some different businesses. We have the resources. I mean, but every governor, including me, has traveled this country saying we have the lowest taxes in the country. And I haven't found anybody who cares. I talked to the gun manufacturers when I was in. We made a tour through New England, and they'd say, you know, taxes might have been 12th or 13th. It was workforce quality, livable communities. I mean, we're down on the floor with the president of the company. You know, he's showing off his operation, pretty amazing operation. But, you know, he points at a machinist. He said, look, if that machinist leaves me tomorrow, I can have a new one in here, equally well skilled, in 3 days. And I made the pitch about, you know, we have workforce training money, and we'll help you train them up. He looks at me and says, well, I'm not in the workforce training business. I'm in the gun making business. And we mistakenly believe that is an economic development policy. I actually have come to believe that it's because I'm selfish and I don't want to pay taxes. Because those companies, they don't really talk about that. I mean, they'll eventually get around to it. But and the other thing they want to know is medical care. You know, and, you know, what kind of schools? You know, schools we could always shine on. But the question about communities, access to air travel, healthcare, quality of life, amenities, particularly with the newer generation of workers, amenities are a big deal. I mean, it's just it's very different when you're on the trail trying to get businesses. We used to, and I see my friend back there from the Business Council, we used to try to get people not to drive up from Denver because we didn't want them to get, he's laughing, but it's true. We didn't want them to drive, we'd fly the plane down there so that they didn't end up, them or their spouse deciding that, you know, this Colorado is a pretty nice place. You know, because, you know, I mean, I had one of them, the spouse told me that, you know, we drove up and the trees grow straight up there, and, you know, it's green, and the communities are vibrant. We stopped for coffee, and I think Fort Collins or Longmont, and, you know, and he said, I just don't know if I want to live in Cheyenne. And a lot of what we're trying to get are those small operations that are owned by individuals. And, you know, we're not going to get We're not going to get a big hydrogen research hub. I mean, I remember when we chased a superconducting super collider. We spent $800,000 chasing it, and it was never in the cards. Never in the cards. But, you know, off we went, full of virtue and vigor, and it just wasn't in the cards. So I really think it's kind of like politics. It really depends on us. If we insist on we're going to harbor all the wealth and hold on to it because we're going to retire, the state's going to retire. But if we treat it like a business and say, if we're not building and we're not growing, we're going to go away, it's a very different view. Now, you know, I don't know if those views are popular or not, but hell, I've never cared whether it's popular or not. That's what I wanted to do. Okay.
Way back in the oil players started to come out.
Yeah.
And one person talked to me about, and she called it, she was an economic development person in a agency here in Wyoming. And she talked about how difficult it was when she brought people in, prospective business people, and she would drive them from the airport, and she called them the concentric rings of the bus. And the community was just so unattractive because it was boom and bust, so grow and it would be neglected and die. And grow and then neglected and die. And I don't know, it's something that you had mentioned Fort Collins, and there's something.
Well, remember, when I first came to Cheyenne, we laughed about Fort Collins and their having a sales tax to build up downtown and have art in the park and all of that. We ain't laughing anymore. They were taxing themselves to build a community. And the second thing they did is our university has always gotten 40 to 50% of its funding from the state. CSU gets about 4%. And it's forced to be much more entrepreneurial and go out and find research dollars, start businesses and build it. And we've never imposed that expectation on the university. In fact, I would argue that the university does not encourage entrepreneurship. But if you look at Fort Collins and look at the institutions in Utah, a lot of the medical stuff, I mean, a lot of that, its nexus was in part in the university system. So, I mean, what it says is that intellectual capital can be converted into capitalist gains, but we haven't chosen to do that. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they look about how much money the state's gotten. Suddenly they get a big request. I got some of those. Yeah. I mean, and you could tell that they'd looked at the revenue projections and all of a sudden they'd revise their imminent needs. Yes, sir.
You hit on something briefly that certainly impacted me in the later years of my working years. That was reliable air transportation out of the various cities here. By that I mean more flights per day than 6 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock. About a flight leaving a year, maybe every 2 hours. What are we going to have to do as a state? What do you think?
Well, I mean,
Going to have to do
yeah.
that type of service to the business community, because I mean, I traveled nationally, I traveled internationally, and making links out of Cheyenne was not going through hell.
Well, yeah, plus for the longest time they'd cancel them if they didn't have enough passengers and you were stuck in Denver. And the rental car agencies, the drop-off charge in Cheyenne was steep. So, you know, I think if we're honest about it, the problem is critical mass. And we don't have the critical mass to support it. The state makes some efforts through kind of a assistance program, and It's worked well in places like Yellowstone or Jackson because they've got, they've got a lot of traffic. Cheyenne doesn't have a lot of traffic. And I think a lot of people, I seldom consider flying out of Cheyenne. First of all, I don't know if there are any flights. I guess they've been resumed. I don't like driving to Denver, but at least I know if I miss a connection, I can get home. And I would say that I don't support, there was an idea floated a decade and a half ago that there be a state airline. That we would essentially pour the state money in to make sure that all of the communities, and then they got in a fight about which communities. My hometown of Thermopolis wanted as many flights as there were going to be in Casper, and I mean it just. And I'm uncomfortable with the state interjecting itself that deeply into the private sector. I'd rather focus on organic growth in the state and in the communities and see if we can get to that. But I wouldn't say my first priority would be to set up an airline that nobody's going to be riding on.
How about high-speed rail?
We looked at high-speed rail. There was a proposal for a while to run high-speed rail up the Front Range and essentially turn Cheyenne into a kind of a bedroom community for that parts of Colorado. It made a lot of sense for Cheyenne. The parts of Colorado weren't all that enthusiastic. And you can't blame them. I mean, they wanted the growth and they didn't want to see it siphoned off. I wouldn't be surprised in the next decade to see them get tired enough of the growth they're having that's an idea whose time might come. But then, yeah. I mean, I think you can see the growth coming right up to where the elevation starts up. That about the same place the roads get snowy, that's about where the growth stops. But I think, if Colorado keeps going the way it's going, particularly that part of the Front Range, that attitude may change. But for now, the Colorado side was remarkably unenthusiastic. Anybody else?
Do you think that this theory of paradox of plenty has trickled down to how communities and municipalities run together?
Well, in part, they're just a victim of it because they have a mill levy limitation. They get around it some with special districts. But their access to significant revenues is entirely dependent on the largesse of the state. During the Nixon era, there was a lot of revenue sharing, which made federal money directly available. A lot of it during COVID. There was what, $8 billion of aid that came into the state for governments alone, half of which went to local jurisdiction, half of it went to the state. So to some degree, they don't have any choice. They get a share of the severance tax revenues, and it's allocated on population, and it goes up and down. And they're dependent on whether the legislature wants to allocate it. Remember, that thing that's been turned on its head was originally this was going to be a local government centric operation. That's where the money was going to be. But if you look at it now, all the money's at the state level, controlled by the governor and the legislature. And it wasn't, I think it was in the 60s or 70s before we started sharing any sales tax revenues. Later than that, when we started giving the local options to them. The communities, 8 mills per city on a tax base that is, I don't know, a tenth of what it was, what it would be if it was fair market value. They don't have any choice. But, a lot of the cities do, I'm always surprised, optional sales taxes tend to do pretty well in Wyoming. Some of them lose, some of them, but more of them pass than get lost. So I think the people of the communities, if they can see what they're getting, I think they're pretty enthusiastic. But I don't think local governments have a lot of choice. And if you're county commission, you have control of 12 mills. Meanwhile, you send me a bill that says 72 mills. And so I get mad at the county commission, but if you read it, you got special districts, you got fire districts, you got schools. Schools are 43 or 45 mills. I mean, and so, you know, I like to yell at and I like to yell at the assessor because my valuation went up. But then I privately say to myself, damn, we're going to make money. We sell this house. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, I'm not immune to the contradictions. I want to be a recovering addict on this problem, and I want to do better. Anybody else? Well, thank you for your time. I'm sorry it extended so long. You're up.